Good evening and welcome to the Nonprofit Management Program at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. I am Cindy Lott. I'm the Academic Director and full-time faculty for the Nonprofit Management Program, and it is my pleasure to have you all join us this evening for our fourth in our series of workshops on the election cycle. We at the Nonprofit Management Program here at Columbia University do teach the importance of policy and advocacy among the many different courses that we offer. Feel it's very important that our sector actually participate and really advocate for what works on behalf of the sector, because after all, what works for us is what's working for our communities. That's really the ultimate beneficiary of the work that we do. Over the years, we've seen, for those of us that work in policy, work in advocacy, we've seen a couple of different issues emerge. The first was that we just didn't have a lot of attention at times paid to policy in our nonprofit sector. We would have certain groups, certain people in certain organizations that might, but it wasn't really socialized across the whole sector. The second issue is about how you actually do policy, how you think about policy and advocacy. And I would say that we've made a lot of progress, my own opinion, on that first point about actually understanding how important policy and advocacy is to our sector. But we're still working on the second part. We're still trying to crack the nut on how we actually do policy and advocacy, participate, and even more so, how we teach it, those of us who are educators. This series is one piece of thinking about how we actually have a pedagogy around learning how you do policy and advocacy when you're in our sector. Excuse me. We decided to have this election series because it's really important to show different junctures across an entire national election, which includes both state and federal. And in some very large cities, as we see, it actually includes the municipalities as well as major policymakers. We're seeing that, right, with sanctuary cities and other really large metropolitan areas. So we're working on that. This is our fourth of these series. And we have tonight at this very major juncture in the national election cycle. On this part, it's mostly federal, but states have them too. This is around the party conventions. And when we first devised this series, probably a year and a half ago now, we knew that in the summer we would be having both of the parties, major parties, and also some of the other parties, conventions coming around. And often, and I speak from experience on this, I've served as legal counsel to 2 national party conventions. A lot of it is actually pretty standard in terms of how the process by which we go through, who gets to be in the room for deciding platforms and the planks that are in them. But this year, that's not the case. And so it is with great pleasure, I welcome a number of experts here who will be able to talk about how you use this particular moment in your nonprofit organization, in our field, about how to advance your own policy views and how to advocate around that. We have, of course, right now 3 historic moments. Of course, COVID has made such an impact on our communities. It has laid bare a lot of different equality issues and inequality issues. It has reached, on our second point, true economic havoc in our communities, and that's being felt in a large and broad way in the nonprofit sector as we try to serve our communities. And lastly, of course, we have major historic moment here in the public view around racial violence and racial inequity issues in our country, all of which is upending the parties and how they're thinking about their platforms. And for the first time ever, we have at least one party that has almost literally reopened its platform for discussions at quite a late date in the election cycle. So this is a very unusual moment. We hope you enjoy this evening. We will have all of the panelists be able to speak, and we will have some Q&A. I have the great pleasure of having both Sue Santa and Sandra Swirsky working on this election series and co-developing it. And they will be introducing our other panelists. Sue and Sandra have both a long and deep history on policy. Sue also teaches in our program. We are extremely glad to have all of them here. I thank you for your time, and we look forward to a really great discussion this evening. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sandra. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Cindy, for that overview, and welcome to all of you tonight. I'd like to begin by adding some additional color to Cindy's remarks about the series. This evening's program is part of a series that began last November and will be winding up early next year. The series was designed to take you through an election cycle in real time, pausing at different junctures, as Cindy noted, such as the primary season and now the convention season, and linking each juncture to opportunities for our sector to advocate for its missions and constituencies. In addition to highlighting the junctures in this series, we've touched on the importance and the issues around accurate counting, whether that be through the census or the actual election. Inaccurate counting can mean skewed representation and skewed funds for communities and your constituents. We've also explored the pluses and minuses of charities broadening or leveraging their advocacy during election season through C4 organizations that have far fewer limits on political activity. Tonight, we have a real treat for you. Sue and I are joined by three superstars. They each bring a different perspective to the conversation tonight. We're going to lead off with context from Susan Milligan, the senior political writer at US News and World Report. Susan is going to offer us a window into the behind the scenes chaos and complexity of a presidential campaign, from the competition of ideas to the brash political tax. And she should know, she's been behind the scenes of 8 presidential campaigns. We'll then hear from Dan Cardinelli. Dan will share his perspective from a top independent sector on the capacity and influence the sector has in elections and how that capacity and influence may be shifting in the current environment. Last but never least, we'll hear from Gloria Johnson-Cusack with a view from the trenches. She'll walk us through the specifics of how her Firelight Foundation is showing up and influencing in this election cycle. So a little about tonight's conversation. Let's start with what we know, and that is the election process has been truly upended. The impact of COVID has made us question how to participate in the process. And looking ahead to November, what voting may look like. Some may query whether it's even worth the risk. The racial justice protests have some questioning whether to stand down on championing their organization's mission, because it could be viewed as insensitive or tone deaf to speak up on issues other than racial justice at this time. One thing we know for sure, you can't sit this one out. Many in the sector have been on the front lines of these two issues and other important ones. Your experiences and perspectives deserve to shape policy moving forward. And if you need more convincing, know this. The sector represents about 10% of the workforce, more than the manufacturing industry, and about even with the retail industry. Are they sitting this one out? No way. They're finding a way to engage, to be heard, and they're happy to fill the void left by. So before we get to our panelists, just one housekeeping measure. We encourage questions. Please type your question in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. With that, I'd like to turn to our first panelist, Susan Milligan. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting. I was asked to talk about how this campaign is different, and the fact that I'm talking to you from my home is a real indicator, because normally at this time I would be on a plane with a candidate and maybe going to several cities or even several states in one day as they go and they campaign. And obviously none of us is doing that, and the candidates themselves are not campaigning out in person all that much, although the president's going to have a big rally in Tulsa on Saturday. So I know every reporter and every sort of politico always says, oh, this campaign is a campaign unlike any other, but this one really, really is. And it's not just because of the coronavirus and how it's changed the nature of campaigning. It's the issues that are involved, it's the candidates involved, and it's really, frankly, the turning point that we're at in history, both politically and frankly, demographically, which is a big part of it. So we have, we have a situation, as we've been mentioned, that we have these three major crises going on. We have a pandemic that, you know, we haven't experienced in our lifetimes, and we have the economic collapse, or, you know, that's come since then. And of course, we have the protests and this attention to, you know, police brutality and racism that, you know, maybe has been there for a long time, but has been certainly elevated because of events recently. And then these things become interlocking, because you really can't talk about racial justice without talking about healthcare inequities among, you know, people of color. Those things are interlinked, and it's become even more important right now. It has even another layer to it when you talk about people going out and being in public at protests because they feel very passionately about this and they want to be out there, and yet you get put at risk when you're out there in a crowd of people with the possibility of spreading the virus. You've got the possibility of not being able to vote or having a difficult time voting because of the coronavirus. And then this has a whole other level of states, some of which are talking about having vote by mail. People don't want to have vote by mail, some people, because they think that there's fraud associated with it, although there's been literally no evidence that that's been the case. But there are states that are pushing back on that. So, you know, forget about even just June and how things will change, how things were different now in June compared to a different June. We may not know who's president until a week after the elections this November. So that's also something to think about. When it comes to this particular campaign too, we have this expression that all politics is local, and that people vote on matters that are important to them and their community. And this year, really unlike any other, and even definitely more than 2016. This is pretty much a national election. Even local elections are kind of a national election. And it's really a referendum on Trump and what he represents and his view of the world and his view and how it got us to here. And Biden is kind of, he's just kind of this, you know, just kind of the stagnant, you know, alternative to it. When you look at the polling, you can see that Trump supporters are actually more enthusiastic about him than Biden supporters are about Biden. However, Biden supporters are really heavily motivated by voting against Trump. So even though Trump's supporters are really passionate, his opponents are really passionate as well. So we're going into an election where it's not just about, you know, how do you feel about, you know, immigration or abortion or whatever. It's part of it, but it's really about Trump as a brand and what he represents. I've never seen any candidate make himself the brand of the party and of the campaign as much as Trump has. I mean, even today when the Supreme Court ruled that his effort to undo DACA, the deferred admission for childhood arrivals, I keep forgetting what the acronym means, which basically means that approximately 800,000 young people who were brought here by their parents when they were very small children can stay. And it was really kind of for technical reasons that the courts threw out that. I mean, he could issue an executive order and undo it tomorrow. And he took it personally. He said, you know, he tweeted out, you know, maybe the Supreme Court has got something against me. He's made the entire election about him, that you're either for Trump or against Trump. It's not even like whether you're a conservative or not a conservative. So that's going to keep a certain part of his base really whipped up, but it also really has just kind of boiled down this entire campaign to you're for him or against him. So the platforms matter, and they'll you know, and they'll be writing them in an entirely different environment. We still don't know whether the Democratic convention is going to be mostly virtual. They keep saying they're going to continue ahead in Milwaukee. You know, they've planned it, of course, for August instead of July, which is when it was previously planned. The Republicans are having sort of the work done of their convention still in Charlottesville, and then, Charleston. And the president is delivering his acceptance speech in Jacksonville, Florida. But so the platforms matter, but I do think that the election itself is going to be so much more based on how that person makes people feel at that point in history. So it's important to have your viewpoint in there, but I honestly think that when it comes down to it, that it's just kind of like you're either for Trump or against him. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Susan. We're now going to transition over to Oh, here I am. We're now going to transition over to Sue Santa, and she's going to continue on with our program. So Sue, do you want to take the ball and run with it here?
Absolutely, Sandra, and thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. So, as I was preparing for this evening, I was thinking back to our last workshop, which was on March 28th, and for many of us, it was our second week of social distancing and work from home. And at the time, I really think we were all just coming to terms with the pandemic. And while we were daunted by this new reality we were in, and perhaps a bit shell-shocked, our hope was that this would be a relatively short disruption. When we asked our panelists at that workshop about the implications of the pandemic on their nonprofits, the conversation focused on immediate and personal implications, because honestly, that was all we all knew at the time. But not long after that, not long after March 28th, the devastating impact on health and healthcare, education, economy, jobs, nearly all aspects of our lives emerged. And the nonprofit sector, while focusing on immediate response and needs, was also forced to face the daunting implications of this seismic shift. We began to see through our own unique lenses that the post-pandemic world could operate much differently than what we'd known before. At the same time, the reality was imposing itself on our election process. So as Susan said, our tried and true systems simply aren't accessible. We're beginning to see a rethinking of the primary process, or we did see a rethinking of the primary process, questions about the conventions, as Susan said, and certainly concerns about voting. And then the ground shook again last month when issues of racial justice could no longer be ignored, and systemic inequalities that have been laid bare once again as communities of color disproportionately experience the devastation of coronavirus and the injustices of excessive law enforcement dominated every discussion, every headline, every video. Black Americans took to the streets not alone, but joined by an extraordinary cross-section of supporters to call out blatant inequalities and seek not platitudes, but true, actual systemic and structural change. So without question, the election playbook, and in fact, all playbooks, are being rewritten. So turning to nonprofits and public policy, how does all of this shift the strategies of nonprofit organizations and their traditional election-related activities? More pointedly, is this a tipping point? Is this a time when nonprofit organizations should not only be doing more, but doing things differently than before? The traditional activities, including primaries and conventions, that shape the contours of the elections are greatly altered. The candidates have been handed three interconnected issues: health crisis, economic and employment crisis, and a social justice crisis. The typical process for developing party platforms and planks, as Susan was referring to, must be far more reactive than prospective. And we have limited in-person access to candidates. So what does our interaction with those candidates look like? And then, of course, significant issues loom over the voting process itself. How will we access the process? What are the barriers? And who is likely to be left out of that process? What safeguards are in place to ensure fairness and accuracy? So with that stage set, I'm going to turn to our next two panelists. First, Dan Cardinelli, President and CEO of Independent Sector. Dan is regarded as one of today's most thoughtful and thought-provoking leaders. Among his many accomplishments at IS, he has infused his strong sense in performance management to drive evidence-based programs and high-impact organizations, and he has positioned IS to lead important research about the field, much of it conducted in real time. So Dan, as we prepared for this panel, you commented that we've entered uncharted territory for nonprofits. You spoke a lot about nonprofits having the ability to give voice to communities and to be sure the voices are heard, whether it's in reframing issues of racial equity or at the ballot box. We spoke about the unique position of the nonprofit sector as a trusted voice. Now, at the same time, you commented and questioned the health of the sector and its ability to play an effective policy role. And to put a finer point on that, on Tuesday, IS released results of a survey that explored the impact of COVID-19 on nonprofits, the results of which, and I'm quoting your release, paint a grim picture of the damage to nonprofits caused by the crisis and the economic shutdown. So Dan, how do all of these pieces fit together? What role do you see nonprofits playing between now and November and beyond? And what's the highest and best use of nonprofit time, talent, and resources? And where might be some of the pitfalls? So Dan, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Sue. And thanks to everybody here. It's an incredible group of folks to be in dialogue with. So I'm gonna make a couple of points and then get to those questions. The first thing I wanna just make super clear is that the nonprofit sector has a particularly important and unique role in being a guardian of our voice, the voice of all people in the United States. And we have a mandate to be able to activate that voice in elections. A healthy civil society, which independent sector thinks about every day, means that every person who has access to their voice through voting or other means should take that up, now more than ever. So I'm gonna make a couple of key points and dive deep into a few things. First of all, I wanna make sure everyone knows that nonprofits are absolutely critical, despite the destabilized moment that we're in, and we clearly are, as the economic pressures from these three perfect tsunamis hitting at the same time are weighing heavily on civil society. But we need to educate policymakers. We have a unique and incredibly important role as institutions that have been stewarding community and really hard-found wisdom and evidence for many, many years. There is a malleability right now that policymakers have that often they don't in normal election cycles. You have these very carefully architected playbooks that you have to play. That's all been thrown out the window, or much of it, and there is an openness and a hunger for the wisdom that the sector has. The second thing is we have a role in both registering and mobilizing voters in a nonpartisan way, but really we are the most trusted set of institutions in America. Let me just say it again. We as the nonprofit sector hold a kind of trust that is unprecedented compared to the other institutions. So we are looked to as a trusted voice for and with community, and our clarion call to community to vote is a critically important role. And thirdly, candidates on platforms, as we've heard already tonight, are really looking for smart, viable policies in response to this perfect storm of issues. Let me just give you a concrete example of how this looks. We've heard, despite a range, I'm sure, of folks on the webinar tonight regarding what you think about defunding the police, there are any number of nonprofits that have been thinking, doing difficult, really hardcore research around various options. They represent a wide range of constituents. So we have a repository in our sector around of 3 or 4 different possible ways that policymakers and candidates specifically could take up this work. So now is not the time, despite what many of us are feeling. So Sue mentioned we released a report earlier this week that indicated that the large nonprofit sector has been hit very, very hard. We've seen basically a 50% reduction in workforce. So at a time when you want to turn inward to take care of yourself, we need to flip that energy and turn outward in mobilizing our voice, our expertise, as well as our constituents. So let me just say one last thing as a resource. I'm going to go into some more detailed information. At the independentsector.org website, we have stood up the Nonprofit Voice 2020 Election Headquarters section. There you're going to find comprehensive resources. We hear this all the time. What can I do? What can I do? What can I say? What can I say? How do I educate and not cross any lines? We've put a whole set of resources together so that the sector is fully empowered with critically important information to be able to take up its leadership role. So I want to say a couple of things tonight, and then I'll turn it back over for an open discussion. There are kind of 3 big points that independent sector wants to make. First of all, we have a role to ensure people vote. That means that we can push through our constituents folks to register and to use their voice. There is collective wisdom in community, and I spent many years in the education space, and I got very tired as a practitioner of having policies come down on me. And then I realized we as an institution, it was communities and schools, needed to take up our leadership role and engage policymakers, not just in elections, but all the time, to be seen as a trusted and wise and critically important expert in their policy formulation. So it wasn't being done to us, but we were formulating policies with folks. That's our job. It's always our job, and we should be doing that now more than ever, but all the time. Secondly, we have a particularly important role, and we've seen incredible civic engagement for folks that are maybe not affiliated with institutions. We as nonprofits can take up our voice and really call on Congress to ensure we have fair and equitable elections. So right now, if you go again to our website, we have a call to action, but call your Congress person and ask them to ensure that the $3.6 billion that we're asking to ensure for safe elections are allocated so that people, particularly folks of color, don't have to choose between their health and their voice. That's critically important. And then the final thing is engage and engage and engage. So there are three things that people can do. They can, as nonprofits, drive voter registration. They can do voter education, again, in a nonpartisan way, and they can do voter mobilization. They can encourage the civic act of voting. So those are all kind of big rocks. The last piece I just want to put for hopefully our conversation is what we've seen with COVID prior to the rising up in response to George Floyd and this incredible reckoning of the historic and systemic racism, is we saw that the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color because of underlying and systemic health issues that the system had really failed them in many regards. The opportunity, I think, for us to ensure that the elections don't play into that is critically important, and particularly communities that are already under siege run the risk of now stepping out and having to use their civic voice and run the risk of their health. So it's a very important moment for us to, those of us who are in nonprofits, to demand for this kind of equity and structure. So I hope to have a conversation about that with folks later on, and I'll turn it back over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Start my video here. Thank you very much, Dan, and we will get back to some of those questions when the group all comes together to talk with each other. Before we do that, I'd like to bring in my dear friend, my co-instructor and colleague, Gloria Johnson-Cusack. Gloria and I together created and teach the Columbia's in Nonprofit Management, our policy and advocacy course. So we've been together for a number of years doing that. Gloria, you have a really fascinating background. It includes positions in the Clinton administration on Capitol Hill with the District of Columbia, as an executive counsel to leaders of the largest nonprofits in the country, advisor to philanthropists, and leading a number of important advocacy campaigns. So in our conversation today, you really could share perspective from any of those experiences. But what I'm most interested in hearing about right now is the work that you are doing with a C4. And I know you're playing a very instrumental role with that C4, which is called Patients for Affordable Drugs Now, that is advocating at the state and federal level. So as we all experience these seismic shifts and witness reframing of priorities, you're actually translating that or needing to translate that into your on-the-ground strategies. So we've covered a lot of ground in our prep, and I'd love for you to share with our audience some of your insights, including how you've altered your plans for the 2020 election and what seems to be working. I know that you have found a bipartisan space, so I'm very interested in hearing about that. how does data inform your strategy? And how do you integrate a DEI lens into your campaign? So with all of that, I am going to throw the microphone over to you, my friend.
Great. Thanks, Sue. Yeah, it's a tall order, but I'm really jazzed about it because it gives me a chance to use our time together now to get to the brass tacks about what can actually work. I think I'm like all of us, we've talked about this on this webinar, we're all grieving, but I am super jazzed and actually joyful because I think if we look at history, we know that this kind of disruption has to happen. And I'm joyful because I'm surrounded by an amazing community of people at Columbia and with the foundations and nonprofits we work with in higher ed and what have you. So I'm going to try to use our time together here to be the advocate and the teacher that I am and do as much as I can to just jump into the presentation of really a case study. And for everyone who's watching, my goal is for you to come away with a sense of the kinds of tools that are necessary if any of us in the sector are going to advance the work that we've all been talking about. So I'm going to invite our colleague Megan, if you can, just pull up a slide. And I'm going to go through a few of them and then we can talk in detail about whatever is of interest to the rest of the group. Just very briefly, the Patients for Affordable Drugs now is a C4, and we are the only national patient advocacy organization that is not funded or that takes significant funding from Big Pharma. We are patient-oriented. I have done electoral politics at the national level. I have not done any partisan politics in 15 years because I'm at the part of my career and my life where I want to use my talents and skills to build bridges. And lo and behold, as a board member of this organization, I get to do that still, to operate in a bipartisan environment. So Megan, if you'll go to the second slide, I'll just sort of tee up what I think would be of most interest to the folks who are watching in. The big aha here is that this work that we're doing on passing legislation so that more drugs are affordable for regular folks in this country is a unique scenario. But there are all kinds of strategic imperatives that are built into the way that we've achieved some traction, which I think would be helpful to lots of us who care about a lot of issues. So in an odd way, we can say, unlike a lot of other issues in our sector, we've been able to do the three things that you see here. But there's a backstory that I think is applicable to all of us. So we have been able on this issue in the last 3 years to achieve legislative and political results that benefits Democrats and Republicans, and all in the effort to improve the lives of folks from every demographic, because the issue of affordable drugs affects all of us. So I want to talk a little bit about how that's happened, but I want to show off and do a victory lap around some of the traction we've got. If you go to the next slide, 3, you'll get a chance to see headlines that honestly, a year ago, we would have never dreamed would have been possible. They're self-explanatory as you look at them here, but the main point is that we have been able to call out Big Pharma, which does great things in many aspects of our society, but when it comes to affordable drug pricing has not been on the right side. And we've been able to influence campaigns for electeds and for incumbent candidates. So I want to talk a bit about how we've been able to do that. I'm going to brag on one more slide and then I'll get to the brass tacks. If you'll go to the next slide, slide 4, you'll get a chance to just get a sense of how this has been a trajectory that has been fast with impact across the board at the federal level, and I'm going to talk about at the state level as well. The main headline here is that we've got an issue that Trump, Pelosi, Senator Grassley, a Republican, and Senator Wyden, a Democrat, all important people in our sector, have been able to take a position on. And so what you see here is just a sort of brief overview of some of the accomplishments we've been able to see, with President Trump revealing a drug pricing blueprint in May, In November of that same year, Democrats running their campaigns on drug pricing and winning. In July, Senators Grassley and Wyden introducing a bipartisan bill, who knew, in July of 2019, and then Speaker Pelosi prioritizing the issue, leading the passage of the most comprehensive legislation ever done around drug pricing, and that was done with all Democratic votes and I think 2 Republican votes. And then, lo and behold, President Trump mentions in the State of the Union address his support of affordable drug pricing legislation. White House director writes an op-ed in support. You get the picture. We've actually been able to, not just by ourselves, but with the support of other important allies, achieve these major milestones. So let's go to the next slide, and I will ask you to go to slide 7 if you can. Megan, just in the interest of time, oh, here we'll stop and just say, at the state level, here is an example of the kinds of milestones we've been able to achieve, also on a bipartisan basis. Since 2017, we've been able to get this kind of reform in states, Democratic and Republican, on the issues you see listed here. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is the most important slide for any of you, especially students who are going to be going back and revisiting or even sharing aspects of the slide deck. I'd say this is going to be the most important explanation about the why, which has some takeaways that can be applicable to many different issues that you might care about in your organizations. There were 4 really important considerations that we used at RC4 to build our strategy, and with all of the twists and turns of this election cycle, still be able to be nimble and relevant and actually optimistic that eventually there will be legislation introduced in the Senate and we will be able to come up with some kind of legislation that will pass no matter who wins. And the 4 issues that we've thought a lot about have to do with polling data, understanding constituents, understanding our positioning with funders, and then building a strategy that's targeted. So on the first point, and this is something that is applicable to all of us, we had the benefit of utilizing existing polling data that tells us that we have a huge asset. And that is that there is deep and nonpartisan support across the country for our issue. We also had a very good sense from this data and from outreach that we've done with RC3 that does lots of grassroots educating across the country to know that patients understand the issue. Patients and their family know that Big Pharma is the opponent on this specific issue, even if they do good things in other aspects of society. And then quite importantly, I know a lot of us are always being ambitious about our fundraising. We talk about institutional fundraising strategies and high net donor strategies and all. We were able to secure significant funding early from a committed source who had a strategic mind and a long-term commitment to philanthropic giving. The main funder is a funder who is a billionaire, it so happens, but who also has helped us leverage resources to be able to take advantage of other supporters. And so we knew we would have that long-term commitment through this election cycle and could plan accordingly. As a result of all 3 of those things, we were able to devise a strategy. This is the most important takeaway. Sue and I teach a policy class and folks hear this over and over because somehow our sector seems to miss it. The strategy has got to have a very specific target audience so that we as an organization can know how to leverage our resources. So because of all of these assets that I just mentioned, we knew that we could leverage our funding and our staff and our coalitions to target specific electeds and specific candidates, especially in vulnerable districts, that we knew we could influence. That was our strategy, and it continues to be our strategy today. So can we go to slide 7? No, let's go to the next one. Yes, that one, thank you. So this is the most important slide for the, to sort of highlight the strategic imperatives that have driven everything that we have done. And then after this, I'm just going to show a few ads and examples of things that we've actually done out there in the trenches. The four most important aspects of our strategy. One was to elevate patient voices. That is the driving force in all that we do. These are authentic people who have empathetic stories to tell, and there's a huge database of these stories that we've been able to mine. We targeted elected officials and candidates, as I mentioned, and then very importantly, and what I think will be a trend, I know Dan, you and your team are thinking a lot about this, we have very intentionally focused on leveraging state progress to show our federal leaders what's possible, what's feasible, both politically and in terms of being able to actually get legislation passed. And then the final element is making sure that we as a C4 serve notice to electoral candidates. And that mostly has come in the form of us being able to say thank you when they've done what we've wanted them to do. So if we can go to slide 10, that would be the slide around data, racial equity and drug prices. I just want to hit on this very quickly. As Cindy mentioned, as Dan mentioned, all of us leaders in this sector are extremely focused on making sure that we're analyzing issues through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, and that we are building into every aspect of our strategic development, execution, and evaluation, our thinking and understanding about the impact of our issues on diverse populations. So in our case, we've been sure to be mindful of these facts that you see in front of you. And they are very powerful, especially as they pertain to issues that we're all thinking about during the Black Lives Matters moment and what's going on in this post-COVID moment. And that is that the three main issues that Black Americans know and identify as most critical to their well-being are healthcare, bias policing and criminal justice, which is the second one, and third, concern about the fairness of presidential elections. Well, lo and behold, it turns out that this very deep understanding about issues that are most impactful into every aspect of the lives of people who live in this country is actually showing up in painful relief, as we've all talked about now. And now as we lead into the 2020 elections, we see that Black Americans have confronted all three of these issues disproportionately and painfully. So what's the main point then? What we know is that with all of the strategic design that went into our campaign around drug pricing, we know for sure that if we see advancements for all, we're going to see advancements, especially for those who are disproportionately impacted. It means now that we have an enhanced opportunity to raise awareness about the way that this issue should be a priority and how it affects all of us. So let's go to the next slide. This is just a visual example, again, of the disproportionate impact on drug pricing to Black and Hispanic people who live in this country. It's a version of what we're seeing all the time. What you see on the bar graph is the contrast in purple of Black to white, and then Hispanic, Latino to white. And the numbers are painfully worse, obviously, in the African American community, but it's also a challenge which we all know is unacceptable in the Hispanic community. All right, next slide. Here's another point that I think kind of shows how substantial the drug pricing issue is. In many ways, it's sort of the canary in the mine shaft. The equitable aspect of this issue shows up when we look at these kinds of proof points. Black and Hispanic people are more likely to be hospitalized and to die from asthma. Well, the inhaler, that is the blockbuster and the most effective one, can run up to $518 for each inhaler, which can only be used for a few months. Hispanic women are 40% more likely to be diagnosed with cervical cancer than white women. And lo and behold, the cost for cancer treatment on average is $15,000 monthly. And so we're working on finding ways to, for there to be screening and preventive treatment that is more affordable to everyone so that this is not even necessary. All right, next slide, please. This is the standard list that all of us, I hope by now, are familiar with. This is the list of tactics that all of us should be thinking about when we are trying to lift the voices of constituents, in this case, patient voices. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, here's where we get a chance to do a show and tell. It's a 30-second ad. And the main takeaway here is that this is an essential element of our strategy for policy change. And that is to get leaders to listen to the stories of patients and to say to them in their districts, you're doing the right thing, here's how it matters. So here's an example of a real life story that has been channeled both through TV media buys and digital ad buys to reach key legislative districts and key thought leader districts. So we can start that now.
My insulin used to cost $26 a vial. Today, drug companies charge up to $350 a vial. This is the same insulin formula I've been using for almost 30 years. There is no reason for it to be this expensive. Now there are bipartisan proposals in Washington that would actually lower drug prices. It would be an historic moment. Mr. President and Congress, we are counting on you.
So very straightforward message. That was a more than six-figure ad buy that we did just on that issue during a specific cycle in elections. The next slide, please, will tee up insights about the final aspect of our strategy, which I really hope we all pay attention to, because we're encouraged that there's going to be more philanthropic giving to C4 organizations. And this is about how we as a C4 organization have served notice and will continue to serve notice to candidates and to existing elected officials that we're not going away and that we have power and we're not afraid to use it. So we call out the opponents. That's Big Pharma in this instance, and often the campaign dollars that are given to have disproportionate impact in elections. We educate legislative staff about viable legislative options, the point that Dan made before. It's not enough just to raise the issues, but we've got to do the work of helping provide insights about legislative policies that can actually work and get passed. And then finally, we said thank you to our allies in their districts, and we've mostly done that through ad buys. So I'm going to show you an example of a few of those. Let's go to the next slide. We're not going to show you this full ad, but needless to say, all of us who are probably listening to this know that Senator Grassley is a pretty major player in our sector. He worked tirelessly on creating legislation around drug pricing with Democratic Senator Wyden, and we wanted to make sure that we thanked him and did not take him for granted. We all know he's got lots of other issues that he leads on. Here's one where we were very proud to say he's been an ally. The next slide. This is one of my favorite ones. So here's an example of how we thanked a Republican member of Congress who at the time was in a vulnerable district. She was one of the 2 Republicans who voted for fair and improved drug pricing. And here's an important quote that gets to the point that we were able to give some insights to her about how this was a viable option that she could vote for. She said to the press, "The bill was far from perfect, but it represents the only opportunity I've had to advance a significant proposal to the Senate. And here's the thing, and compel action to lower drug prices." So it doesn't have to be, the enemy doesn't have to be, the perfect doesn't have to be the enemy of the good. We were able to get her support for something that she could stand behind, still be able to have some wiggle room on whatever the final vote might be on another piece of legislation, but to get the credit and signal to her constituents that she cares about this issue. On the next slide, please. Here's an example of how we made sure that the press then told the story about the power of our C4. So a local press story talked about how we intend on not just running ads, but we're going to sponsor posts through Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. Again, we're not going away. We're going to give credit to the candidates that are on our side of the issue. Next slide. I'm not going to go into all of these, but the main point I want to convey here is that we have not been shy as C4, as a C4 organization, to say that we're not messing around and we're strategic. So here is an example of the executive director of our C4 speaking to the press saying, we know Big Pharma didn't want her, that Republican member of Congress, to vote this way. We know that drug companies ran ads. Given the way she voted, she clearly stood up to intense lobbying pressure from drug companies. We knew those kinds of quotes would be helpful for her constituents to hear, and we're happy about the solutions that we've been able to achieve. So I'll stop there and then come back to you, Sue, and see if there are any questions you have with that, or if we're going to be able to mix it up with the rest of the group.
Thank you so much, Gloria. I'll have to say, I love to see the strategic framework that we teach in our class actually coming to life in the real world. It does work.
Yes.
And that's a little bit of a plug for our class to those students who are on the line and to maybe take a look at us for your fall semester. So with that, I am going to turn the microphone back to Sandra, who is going to bring in all of our speakers. And we're now going to have a chance to talk among one another. So Sandra, mic is back.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to ask Gloria a question, and then I'd love Dan and Susan to react to it. Gloria, in a couple of sentences, you could talk about why a C4 and why not a C3? What prompted you to set up a C4 to do what you are doing? Most organizations that are charities are C3s and haven't really thought about C4. So in a couple of words, could you talk about why a C4 over a C3?
Yes. So two simple answers, and it's deeply personal. One is that, as I sort of alluded to before, it's important for me now to use my experience working in all sectors, business, nonprofit, philanthropic, education, to build bridges, because I have a perspective that I find can be helpful, especially at a time when we are so divisive. And here was an opportunity for me to take my political expertise, but to apply it in a place that's still meant to achieve finality, to find common ground, and to get traction. So it was good for my soul, and it was a way that I knew I could be impactful. The second is that I would say there was a choice for me to be a board member in this organization, while I also am a board member at a foundation that does more of the direct service work. As you know, the Firelight Foundation is based in Silicon Valley and does work in Africa. Because it's sort of a good complementarity. You know, I get a chance to focus on how I can help create systems change while also working in this area using another part of my brain here. It doesn't mean that the C4 work is more important than C3. It's just a matter of us figuring out where we are in our careers and our trajectories and where we think we can be most helpful.
I think, thank you for that. I was trying to get at, organizations set up C4s because they want to do specifically political work, and C3s can't do political work.
Right.
And so why the structure as a C4 versus the structure as a C3? What juice did you get out of a C4 that you're not able to get out of a C3?
Okay, got it. So I should say there is a C3 version of this organization. And so the structure of this C4 then enables us to take the groundwork that's done to educate patients, to educate leaders, and do the work that's non-electoral to sort of soften the soil, if you will. And then the tools that we have then for the C4 allow us to take those patient stories and knowledge about what's going on in the landscape, and then target those dollars to buying those ads to affect the people, the electoral outcomes of the candidates and the nominees. So there's a very clear firewall, but there's some obvious compatibility going on between the two. Is that what you wanted me to articulate, the differences between what the two can do?
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Dan and Susan, I'm going to bring you in here. Most C3 have a C4 component, and we'd love your thoughts on charities actually setting up C4s to leverage their voice, as you noted, Dan. There are pros and cons, and I'd love your thoughts on that, Susan, from a media press perspective, and Dan from an organizational perspective.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say something I should have said in my opener, which when you talk about the credibility of nonprofits, and I can tell you that nonprofits have a great deal of credibility with the press, because we look at you and we don't think you have an agenda. I mean, a good agenda, but we don't think that you have a nefarious agenda, basically, and we believe your numbers more and so forth. So that's absolutely the case. But at some point, you have to get political, because these are the people who are going to be voting on what you want. And that ad was excellent, because the ad really, that's what people want to see, and that's what members of Congress want to see. It's like, it's just you want to be able to see how this affects an actual person instead of numbers. The second thing is, and this sounds so simple, but I don't understand why more people don't do it, but thanking that member of Congress, particularly Republican, who might not necessarily be associated with, being against Pharma, those of us who lived through that 3-hour vote, on Medicare Part D, remember that very well. But just thanking a member of Congress means a lot, and it especially means a lot to a member who's in a district that's tough to hang on to. Says, okay, maybe I'm not with you on, everything you think of ideologically, but this was me taking on a big lobby to do something for people in their day-to-day lives, and I thought that was really, really smart, Gloria. It was a really and let's face it, like, all they hear all the time are people complaining about them. So sometimes it is nice to say thanks.
So I just want to pick up on a point Susan just made regarding trust. And it's really profound, just to stop for a moment, in the world in which we live, to say that the press will look to nonprofits primarily as a trusted set of institutions that will give them an ability to then kind of build a story or share with the public what is going on. And so when you get involved in partisan politics, you run the risk of diminishing that trust that is so critical for then the informed public to make good decisions. So the firewall that exists between C4s and C3s is critical. And what's behind it, and there's a lot of information, again, if you go to our website, we can give you that, but the point I want to make on this is the following, that a nonprofit, a C3, that it does not get involved in partisan politics, ultimately holds the good of the community at the center of their decision making. And in some regards, whether that is somebody that you politically agree with or not, and I thought Gloria's case study was fantastic, right? Sometimes you find allies that may not agree with you on other issues, but are critical for your particular issue. And C4s can support that in a different way. C3s hold that as their primary value, and that's the trust that folks really kind of anchor in on. The second thing is, when you give to a C3, you get a tax deduction, right? And so if you start having a tax deduction linked to a C4, that means that charitable donations could be used for partisan politics. We think that will be disastrous for the trusted sector. So keeping the firewall, but to both Susan and Gloria's point, the civil society nonprofits should have a tool in their toolbox to be politically active. We know that other industries, for-profit industries, have that. And so the C4 affords that opportunity. You just aren't afforded the same tax benefits to be able to run that. So I thought it was very powerful that Gloria said we had a long-term billionaire funder that gave us the staying power to be able to align with our C3 desires, but gave us another tool, right? Now that billionaire was not getting tax benefits for those political activities that she or he were underwriting, whereas she or he may make a donation to the executive director of the C3 to be able to do good research that is great for all candidates. So it's just an important firewall. And there's a lot of misinformation. Sandra, you and I have talked about this for years, and Cindy, who's an expert on this as well, where there is this kind of blurry line. And again, I think the sector is far more conservative than it needs to be. Nonprofits can be actually quite active in educating policymakers about the issues. And to Susan's point, we're trusted in doing so.
Dan, do you see C3s, charities, exploring options to set up C4s, or do you think it is just a handful of the more sophisticated, more or less risk averse?
To set up a C4, you have to have a fairly high degree of understanding about the laws that govern this, and you have to have access to donors that will not cannibalize your own organization, your C3's resources. So that greatly eclipses down who this is available to, which is unfortunate. It tends to be the larger nonprofits that have access to a range of resources and really good legal counsel. And so networked organizations, I just want to give a shout out, I think are quite powerful, where you can have a national office that can afford to do a C4 and speak on behalf of the whole network that are all C3s. It's just an interesting model that then kind of allows for political power to be focused without risking the tax status of C3s.
Thank you for that. I'd like to switch gears a little bit, talk about parties' platforms. At their core, a party's platform is its vision for the future. This year is no different. While I think many can agree with Susan that this election is likely to be less about a party's platform and more about personality, namely President Trump. But a platform is also important for accountability. It holds a candidate's feet to the fire long after they're elected. And as Cindy noted, Joe Biden's campaign recently announced that he was scrapping his platform and opening it up for input. And I'd love to hear from each of you. What does that mean to you? Where's the opportunity there? Gloria, you want to go first?
Sorry, go ahead, Gloria.
Well, I would just say it's powerful because in my experience from working on 2 national presidential campaigns, the pain and agony of negotiating platforms is really about posturing, as you said, for that accountability. And it's posturing. Nobody even pretends that what is created from the platform is going to directly translate to a legislative agenda. Not the insiders that are really, playing ball and trying to persuade and, tinkering over this and that. It's about sending a signal to your power base about your priorities. And so symbolic, I think it is highly impactful that Biden has announced that because of the signal that he's giving around his analysis of what our priorities should be, and that he's basically saying, we don't know, have to think and act anew. And that to me is a wonderful sign. And I'm not yet ready to give up on the possibility that perhaps the Republican leadership will be thinking the same way, because they have to think not just about this election cycle, but the 2 that are coming later, when the demographics and lots of other things will be changing and requiring some adjustment.
I think that's so, and I think especially because the nominee is Biden and there's a big segment of the party, the progressive wing of the party, younger voters who, they're going to vote for him because they can't stand Donald Trump, but they think of him as sort of old school and they want Medicare for all. The idea that he's willing to open up the platform, and I'm not sure it'll be Medicare for all, but it'll probably be something a little bit closer to that than it was. And again, I don't think for a minute Medicare for all would pass, even if the Democrats take the Senate back. It's going to be something more incremental before it gets there. But sometimes it is about just saying who you are as a party, what your values are, what matters to you, and then it moves more in that direction. But I think that's a big part of it with Biden, is making it clear that even though he's been in Washington for a long time, I don't think the rank and file of the party sees him as the embodiment of the future of the party, either demographically or sort of ideologically, but he's saying he wants to, accommodate where the party is going, even if he's the one kind of handing off the baton at some point.
So I just want to make a distinct point. I totally agree with both Sue and Gloria. but it's a really encouragement as a learning moment for those on the call with us. If you're going to be involved in providing critical information based on your expertise or your organization's expertise to the campaigns, you have to do it to both campaigns and be exceedingly aggressive if you get to one to get to the other. And there's a really important reason for that, that we want to retain this ability to say, we are using our expertise on behalf of the common good, and we want to give both candidates the opportunity to know what our constituents or community and community expertise really has a considered point of view. The purview of the C4 is to pick who is going to be your winner and to invest in them. And so there is a big difference here when a C3, and I would highly encourage expert C3s representing the community to harness their voice, do their good research, and get their message to both campaigns. If one is more malleable at this point than another, that's their purview or their decision. But to do one and not the other is really to abdicate our responsibility to steward good information and good policy recommendations to political decision makers.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you for that reminder. I can tell you're a cross every T and dot every I type of guy.
I have a whole group of people that keep me honest. Believe me, as you all know, I'll be killed tomorrow morning.
So I want to pick up on something that you said.
Oh, go ahead.
I just want to pick up on something Dan said, which is whether you're a C3 or a C4, you have to get your message equally to the campaigns. And I want to drill down on that a little bit. When you say get your message to the campaigns, what advice do you have to charities out there whose ears have perked up because Dan has said, get your message? What advice do you have for them?
So I have a couple, and I think Gloria has a kind of expertise here on this one that I think will be very valuable. First, if we're thinking about it just now, it's pretty late, like too late. This is a long game. And so, it's a little bit like saying right after on January 2nd, oh, it's time to get in shape, right? When it's really a commitment all year round. And so our advocacy efforts with policymakers should be continuous, right? And again, not all organizations have the bandwidth or the resources to do that. And so it's really investing in advocacy organizations with whom you have affiliation and trust. Washington, D.C. is full of those kinds of organizations, and there's a reason for that. How they're governed, I think, is another issue, which I'd love to talk about at some other time. But so those organizations then should have a set of relationships all the time with various operators and getting their message and testing those ideas back and forth. And then when the administration and Congress are in, that is another opportunity for constant refinement. So use organizations that have footholds already with the campaigns. Find where there's real affiliation, lend your voice and your expertise is what I would recommend now.
Thank you. Susan, do you have anything you want to add? You've probably seen a lot of this from the other perspective.
I mean, I think Dan's right in that it's a little late right now to try to sort of make your case to the parties. I just also think this is a really unusual year, and there's a getting into the weeds that's not going to happen this year. There's something more, there's a sort of more fundamental choice happening this year. It doesn't mean that you don't want to get your agenda across, because it is going to matter, when the election is over, but it's an iffy time to try to make it happen. You're absolutely right about that.
The only, yes to everything that everyone has said, and the only thing to add, all of you will smile when I say this because we're all involved in it, that even as this is a long game, we should never underestimate the value of demonstrating when there is a shared point of view on a big policy question, like preserving charitable tax incentives, something that we learned all sides care about, all of us on this call, other than you, Susan, bless your heart. But we can get you to write about it some more. Had something to do with showing how all aspects of the sector were supportive of that issue. That gives some clearance for people on all sides in both parties to feel emboldened to take a stand and therefore be held accountable later when the time comes for actual legislative policy.
Can I jump in here, Sandra?
Thank you.
So,
So did you want to jump in?
yeah, absolutely. I want to remind our viewers to enter any questions you might have in the Q&A box. I want to pick up on something that Susan said, just so it doesn't kind of get lost in the conversation, which is getting your issues in front of the candidates. And of course, there aren't just the presidential candidates. There's all kinds of races across the country. Every member of the House, about a third of the Senate, not to mention governors and legislators and everybody else. But yes, it's probably a little late on the platform, but to Susan's point, after the election, work begins on the actual, moving of issues. And there's something to be said for establishing yourself as a trusted voice, an informed voice, a great resource on your issue, even if it isn't on the platform at the moment, because that with people who then begin to shape what's going to be coming after somebody wins an election, gets defined in these months. The lists are being kept of who can be trusted and who's a good resource. And so we will have kind of this same conversation in November at our next workshop, and then in February at the one after that, don't be too late to the party, right? Jump on in and get there and become a voice. So thank you, Susan, for raising that, because I think it sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, or people feel like there's nothing they can do now, when we're at a time where I think a lot of people are feeling more empowered, more of a voice because of all of the disruption we're feeling. So that's my little, soapbox moment here. I'm going to turn to tee up something that Dan wrote recently and get all of your thoughts on the question I'll ask. So earlier this month, Dan published a blog entitled See, Judge, Act, and I highly recommend it to everybody viewing. It is really a wonderful piece, and you can find it on the Independent Sector website, so giving you a plug there, Dan. And in it, Dan says, as leaders in this sector, we are the heart and conscience of the nation. As leaders, we cannot recoil from the pain of the moment or allow it to overwhelm our individual and organizational ability to respond to the structural racism once again laid bare so clearly. So with that as our lead-in, I'm going to start with Dan. Dan, I'm really interested to hear, as you have been talking to a lot of nonprofit leaders, I'm sure you're doing that day in and day out, not only on the issues of structural racism, but also some of the other very high importance issues right now around healthcare and the economy. How do you see nonprofit leaders digging in? Where are they turning from talking about it to action? And what's been your kind of reaction to what you've seen? And then to the rest of the group, I'm really interested to hear from your perspectives what you're seeing or finding is particularly influential right now.
It's a great question. So there's a range of responses that I'm seeing, really very dependent on how under siege an organization is from the financial impact of the pandemic and the resulting economic crisis. But even with those that are deeply, having to figure out how to make payroll, there is a deep belief that they are called at this particular moment to draw on the values that they have been living out of and when kind of in normal times. So there's enormous amounts of innovation and a kind of heroicism I see, folks, showing up without pay, taking on risks in terms of protecting kids and families, being first responders. It is, in a sense, the nonprofit sector at its absolute best. So and that is kind of a uniform response. That being said, I want to augur in on this moment of kind of racial reckoning that the country is taking, I think, very seriously. And I see leaders doing two things at the same time, which is very tricky. One, taking a hard look at the mirror and asking, how is their organization both contributing to the problem and contributing to the solution? So kind of walking the talk internally and taking really difficult decisions. And at the same time, taking a public stance in times when historically they may have been much more careful in their couching and their denouncement. The number of organizations standing in solidarity at this moment for social change, even when it sits far outside their mission, is profound and I think quite heroic. So those are really encouraging to me. And again, I do want to say that the sector is under profound financial duress and will be probably for the next 36 months.
Others, Gloria, Susan, what are your thoughts on kind of what's
Yes.
and what you're seeing as influential?
Yes, I would say two things. One is that because I work a lot with the leaders and the boards of foundations and nonprofits who are disproportionately white people, I am experiencing extreme grief and Dan's language, a sense of reckoning that is really internal, as well as a matter of, you know, them sort of looking at their role as leaders. I think that's spectacular because it means that this is a moment for serious reflection, not just an inflection point, the movement out there, but a point, an opportunity for people to really reflect and look at their own practices and say, I know my heart has been right, but have I been as intentional? Have I prioritized the allocation of resources, the strategic decision-making, the inclusive process of having people at the table to actually help us as an organization identify what our main objectives should be? Are they the right objectives? This deep kind of questioning, I think, is really transformative. And I know all of us on Columbia faculty care a whole lot about changing the status quo. All of our pedagogy is about change. A lot of us as faculty members and leaders are thinking about how we can be even more emphatic. What I would say, and so I'm happy about that. The challenge that I would offer to all of us as leaders is to pay attention to our people and our partners, and to recognize that we are literally traumatized as human beings. And to have people of color or people from marginalized communities in your organizations, workers, partners, volunteers, they may be walking around, we may be walking around looking completely functional and actually excelling at things that we do because we've learned how to do that. But this is a deeply painful, wrenching experience. And so my challenge is for us to do what we can to make sure we're paying attention to our own people and creating opportunities for us to listen and learn, not just for the emotional support, but also because these people have perspectives that now are sort of can be unlocked, and where they may feel that there's more permission for them to speak truth to us as powerful leaders within our organizations. And I wouldn't want us to miss that opportunity.
That's interesting. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's interesting. I didn't know that the leadership of nonprofits was overwhelmingly white, but of course, why wouldn't it be? It's true of, so many other institutions. One thing that I'm trying to cling to, like things that are sort of encouraging now, and when we look at previous movements, I find that the movement now is a more multi-generational, more multiracial than it's been. The second thing, it's interesting because we have this tendency of, probably in the media we do this, to think of like corporate America and nonprofits as almost being like this, and they don't necessarily have to be. And the interesting thing is that corporate America, which when I was a kid, and my parents were quite active in like the anti-war Vietnam War movement and so forth, corporate America was presented to me as like the single most conservative reactionary institution on the planet. And when you thought about Dow Chemical, you thought about napalm. And now it's been corporate America really that's been moving state governments and less successfully the federal government on a lot of social change. Now, I'm not sure it's out of the goodness of their hearts. It may well be because that makes sense for them in terms of recruiting. It makes sense in terms of consumer relations. I mean, you look at these states with their bathroom bills and so forth, and the reason they pulled back is because companies were threatening to pull out of North Carolina or Georgia or whatever, and that was the influence there. What we see now with the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, you know, even the sports community, and finally apologizing to Colin Kaepernick. Now, my attitude is give him a job and I'll take that seriously. You know, apologizing isn't enough, but you are seeing corporate America move for whatever reason, and it may be a reaction just to, you know, appealing to the consumer, but I'm wondering if there won't be more of a connection between the corporate world and the nonprofit world, which I have to say I do take the nonprofit world more seriously or credibly than I do the corporate world. And I don't even mean that as a knock. I mean, the corporate world, they're in business to make money, whereas the nonprofit world, you know, you've got a mission there, and it's generally, you know, what most of us would say is a good mission. But I'm wondering if there might be more of a coming together of the minds there, and maybe this will provoke that.
I would just comment that my observation and my excitement is it's not uniform, but there is a intentionality in corporate America around partnering with nonprofits. Great. That is a wonderful beginning to shift from a transactional relationship where corporate America contracted with nonprofits to now a real dependence on the wisdom that nonprofits bring by virtue of their work. It's never perfect, but it's quite notable, and I think really encouraging.
That's great to hear.
I say that I think social entrepreneurs are going to increase in numbers based on all that we're seeing with the economy, and they are highly likely to be channeling more of their funds towards C4 activities for all of the reasons we're talking about now. So I would hope that we're going to be ready for that sector.
That's interesting. Can I just make one derivative point? Gloria just made me think of it. I have seen over my 30 years in the sector a number, but not a small number, of corporate government relations shops partnering with a couple of key partners that are their nonprofit partners and availing their formidable infrastructure in support of key nonprofit issues. When that happens, it's insanely powerful. It preserves the trust that nonprofits want to have in their C4, and a partner is able to use not just their cash, but their whole clout to really tip very positive social issues, social justice issues. It's really, it's quite a combination when it happens.
Reminds me of my days years ago working in the oil and gas industry. We saw that all the time abroad, where you had NGOs, is what we called them back then, partnering with companies, and it was really a tremendous result. So we're going to go to closing comments, just a minute or less of closing comments from our panelists, and then we'll go to Sue to wrap up, and I think then we'll be off to the races. So let's see, ladies first, of course. Gloria, do you want to start off? Closing comments.
Yeah, okay, my closing comment is always going to be a challenge because I'm never happy with the status quo, and none of us are. So it would be for all of us in whatever spheres where we operate, for all of us on this as panelists and for all who are listening, to just be intentional about what I call in my faith leadership, but it's really just about being humble enough in our leadership to listen and learn and find out what it is that we don't know, and then create space at the table, bring more people in for a diversity of perspectives, not just representation, that informs the way that we go forward. If we can just decide that we're going to be intentional in that process and in that approach of leadership, then I think we'll be making leaps and bounds forward in a way that, frankly, a lot of us in the public are already thinking about and doing and wishing for.
I'll go.
Susan?
Well, I'll say what I always say at the end of any kind of panel where I talk about politics, and that is vote. And I'll tell you, I used to think of voting as a privilege, and I don't anymore. I lived in post-communist Europe for 5 years, and I think of it as responsibility. And I'm embarrassed to say that when I was in college, I think I would say things like, don't vote, it only encourages them, or something stupid like that. But if you don't like the major candidates, write somebody in, write in Mickey Mouse. But if you don't show up and vote, they will not take you seriously, and they won't take your issues seriously. And now it's never been more important.
So I'm just going to build on Susan's point, vote, but also as nonprofit leaders, you can mobilize other people to vote, and you should. It is, my fear about this election is that it will be questioned.
Yeah.
And it will, so to the extent that we have Americans coming out and clearly expressing their civic duty, to Susan's point, it will minimize, I hope, the sense that there was fraud or this was an illegitimate election. If we fall into that, we're going to be in dangerous civic space. So nonprofits should step into their leadership role of not just encouraging their staff, but everybody to register and to vote.
Right.
Thank you, all of you. So with that, our workshop is about to come to a close, and Sandra and I want to thank our fabulous panelists, Dan, Gloria, and Susan. Thank you so much. We also want to acknowledge the hard work of the team at Columbia's nonprofit management program and extend our big thanks to Francis, Robin, Liz, and Megan. Well, the election day is just over 19 weeks away. It's hard to believe. And a lot can happen in 19 weeks. If you think of looking back 19 weeks where we were, it sure wasn't here. So we'll be watching very closely to see how today's issues play out over the course of the summer, through the conventions, and into the final sprint to November 3rd. Our 5th workshop in this election series is on November 12th. And Sandra and I will host a large panel of policy and nonprofit leaders to get their initial reactions to Election Day. And to Susan's point, let's hope we know who won by the 12th, but we shall see. And get early thinking about priorities for the remainder of 2020 and 2021. We know it'll be a lively conversation, and we hope you can join us. And finally, Sandra and I want to extend our heartfelt thanks to Cindy Lott for hosting the Election 2020 series.